Hi, I'm Hannah Bowler, editor at The Subthread. This is the Brandmakers, a series about innovative brands and the people driving them forward. In this episode, I'm joined by Paul Ridsdale, who's Director of Marketing and Brand at ITV. This series is presented by SBS, helping brands and independent agencies deliver high-impact programmatic advertising. Long live the podcast.
Long live the podcast. Yeah, I listen to a lot, so it's nice to be on one.
Yeah. What are you listening to?
I listen to a huge range of different podcasts actually. So the podcast I have a commute that's probably about an hour each way, so that's 2 hours.
That's a lot
2 hours a day
of
of time, and most of it is filled with podcasts. A huge spectrum of stuff. So obviously some marketing podcasts. So Uncensored CMO, a shout out to that one. But lots of other subjects as well. Big sports fan, I mentioned earlier, so sports podcasts. But also like a history podcast, like a science podcast.
Which history? I'm a history girl.
I'm doing, well, it's a bit of an advert for Goalhanger really here, because it's sort of the rest is history, and the rest is science is one I'm also now getting really into. So I did physics at university, so there's a bit in me that's still a bit of a sort of a science geek behind it. So I love a bit of that, and I actually find that it comes to sort of the where do you get creativity from actually point. I sort of think having that a broad spectrum of stimulus is really helpful, and actually sometimes you get your best ideas from the unexpected place. So you would think I'd get most of my work ideas from the marketing podcast, and sometimes that's true, but actually sometimes there's something in a science podcast that you kind of go, oh God, that's an interesting sort of principle or theory, and we can apply that actually to a problem we've got at the moment.
Your audience isn't in one place. They're everywhere. Watching, scrolling, switching. And your media? Scattered across platforms, tools, dashboards. More data, less clarity. Welcome to SBS, connecting the dots in modern media so you don't have to.
On budgets then, how has that sort of changed in terms of where do you have more or less money to spend on marketing of shows and big brand? And two, how do you, if you're then technically promoting thousands of shows, how do you work out how to split that spend and what gets money? Because I do feel like there's been less money put into big show marketing, just as like all broadcasting has suffered a little bit. I don't know.
Well, I mean, for us, that's not necessarily not true. I think certainly our total investment in marketing has gone up over the sort of, as I say, if you looked over the long term, sort of 10, 15 years, that I've been at ITV, investment in marketing has gone up. Actually, the market has become increasingly competitive. But we're always trying to balance. We've got lots of evidence when we look at the ROI of our marketing. So is it essentially bringing in viewers at a cost that we are then making enough commercial revenue off the back of that, so it needs to be profitable, the investment we make. So we're very careful about how much money we spend, but we have been increasingly investing in it because we see it as a lever for growth. Particularly I mentioned earlier about launching ITVX and having to really scale up ITVX. Marketing was a big lever of that growth. So we're investing quite a bit in marketing. So the direction of travel hasn't been downwards for us. And I guess it is that mix. There's sort of broadly three main ways we invest that money. So sort of brand, so in like activity like the campaign we talked about earlier, so activity which promotes the overall brand, and then in content the spend splits in sort of two ways. So big campaigns which are about our big content priorities where we're trying to sort of excite the whole nation about a particular show, and then that more personalized sort of recommendations for individual people, and you're just constantly trying to optimize those three spends essentially to have the maximum impact overall.
That middle bit, in terms of sort of getting the whole nation behind an individual show, have there been any interesting sort of innovations or any different ways you've been doing that? Because obviously, I think TV marketing at the moment is having a real big moment, and I obviously, with sort of like Netflix doing everything like these big experiential events, and even I saw Channel 4 doing that sewage campaign the other day. I thought that was really interesting. It does feel like there's a bit of a they're there's some interesting stuff
Yeah,
happening in that
yeah.
space. How do you guys think about how to make big cultural moments
Yeah.
around a particular show, and how has that sort of changed? Or
Yeah, definitely the sort of media channel mix has definitely changed. I mean, lots of things are still on the media plan that would have been, a
yeah,
long time ago. Outdoor posters, both for ourselves and lots of other people in the category, remain, a big backbone of the plan and great for just sort of broad awareness. I think that some of the interesting things that have come along. I mean, one of the things we know, which I think is really interesting about the main way that viewers discover new shows or find out about new shows is recommendations, right? So I don't know if you think about that yourself, that one of the main ways I find out TV shows is a colleague or a family member saying to
well, yeah.
me,
I mean, I asked you at the
yeah, you
beginning,
asked me
like,
at the
what are you
start, yeah.
watching?
So
Like, I need to know these things.
hopefully this works, but that's what we know that that's the main place that finds. So I guess we're always looking at what are the media channels which can fuel that sort of recommendation. So in the traditional sense, that would have been PR, right, and trying to get journalists to write about shows, and that's still a really important thing. That influencers now have become a really big sort of extension of that. So we've got a big both organic influencer program, which we call ITV Insiders, where we're constantly bringing in a group of influencers to really immerse them in our shows and give them sort of sneak peek behind our shows, to drive talkability around those. And then you have paid influencer activity as well. So that's a good example of where you're looking at what are the media channels which sort of drive that recommendation. I guess the other example of that, which has become quite powerful, is sort of advertising on the connected TV homepage. Because again, if you think about when you switch on your connected TV and the sort of homepage recommends things to you, right? And there's sort of that is another form of recommendation. So yeah, we found that advertising on those home screens when you first open them has been incredibly impactful as well.
Yeah, because you're no longer like ranked on 1, 2, 3, 4. That homepage comes out, and you're like competing for that.
Yeah, I mean, you have some stuff is still regulated, and your app might, needs to be in certain rails on there, but then you tend to have sort of big hero masthead spaces where there's, one or two shows being promoted, and we work a lot with a lot of our platform partners to try and make sure ITV are in those placements as much as possible. But on some platforms, you can essentially buy those placements. It is essentially point of sale, right, for television. It's what retailers and supermarkets have been doing for years. If you're in a retailer, you want to be on the gondola end in a supermarket. That's where you want your packet of crisps to be. On connected TV, those sort of placements is sort of that's literally when people are about to make a viewing decision.
That's a good comparison, actually. That's a very good comparison. Have you guys done any like experiential, or do you do any sort of like more immersive?
We have done. A lot of ours tends to be linked to the influencer program, actually.
Okay.
So the main sort of way we see the return on those big events, certainly if you're talking about a sort of very sort of secret cinema-esque sort of creating an immersive world around our shows. We do that quite a bit now, actually, but those are created for influencers mainly, because to get the return on those sorts of investment, you need the people who are coming to them to have, a lot of reach behind them, essentially. So yes, we do a lot of that, but it's sort of, those experiences are fuel for the influencer program.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, whereas before it would have been more like a press event, but then you can't really guarantee
Or
that.
it's sort of a picture stunt, isn't it? Often.
Yeah.
So, and again, that's the purpose of that. If you do those sort of things, is tends to be more you're hoping that those pictures make it into the media rather than the number of people who might actually walk past it on the road.
I'm just thinking of some examples the last few years where ITV's really had these big cultural moments, and how you like I'll go back to the like fuel the flames,
Fanning the flames,
fanning
yeah,
the flames,
yeah.
or like build around a hype. So obviously, like, I feel like in the Mr. Bates Be the Post Office was like a prime example of like a real big moment. And love to know how, like, when that sort of percolates, how you then
It's
build around it, if that makes sense.
that is the perfect example of a fanning the flames moment. That it's interesting. It's sort of quite hard to imagine now, but in the build up to Mr. Bates vs. the Post Office, I don't think anyone at ITV actually thought it was going to be anywhere near
I love when these
as
things
impactful
happen.
as it was. We thought it was a brilliant, powerful bit of television, and we were really proud to be making it. But I don't think anyone thought this was going to be a big, mainstream smash hit from a viewing figure point of view. And so there was a marketing campaign at the launch, but it wasn't one of our big priorities. It didn't have a big paid spend behind it. But then, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, as soon as it landed, you quite quickly saw that there was this, just enormous sort of momentum behind it, and the conversation that was starting behind it, the viewing figures started to pick up. It started to be talked about in Parliament. So we did then, put more marketing support behind it, to make sure that people knew if they were hearing about this show where to come and watch it. I think you could also argue just from a brand point of view that everyone was talking about this show, and we sort of wanted, for ITV to sort of get that clear association back with the show. I think what was interesting then to show you how these things can just keep coming back, it then sort of died down again, the viewing, and then suddenly Alan Bates gets his knighthood, and so we came back with another campaign at that point, changing all of marketing to Sir Bates versus the Post Office, and suddenly you see another uptick in viewing and another whole wave of people coming in to watch the show at that point.
That's quite cool, just like responding to it in real time.
Yeah.
That's quite different to being a marketer in the past, I guess, being able to like turn stuff on and off a bit more.
Yeah,
that's very interesting. Actually, you touched on something as well, relating something back to the broadcaster, because I feel like that is something that is interesting in TV, in terms of you've got these shows and they speak for themselves, but how you, especially in a streaming world when stuff it might end up on Netflix, or it might end up on, there's all so many deals that you then still need to make sure that people are aware who owns the show or who made it.
Yeah, I think it comes back to actually, why we're investing in the brand this year, actually, because often you hear content is king, right? And it's just about the content, and we talk about that a lot ourselves. And to be clear, the only reason people watch television at the end of the day is content. Because I think people don't watch brands, they watch content, and that's absolutely true. People ultimately want to find the best content. But what's really interesting, and the reason, as I say, we're investing in brand a lot, is we do a lot of work looking at how viewers make decisions about what to watch. And because there is just so much content out there nowadays, the stat I like is across all the different streaming services in the UK, I think it even excludes YouTube, so this is sort of the sort of streaming services, I think it's 90 years worth of content now across all of them, and that assumes you never sleep or eat or do anything else, right? So there is too much content for anyone to physically watch. So how do viewers in that sea of content make choice about what to watch? And what was really interesting when we looked at this sort of research on this is, when viewers are trying to look for find a new show to watch, 40% of the time they know what show that's going to be when they sit down to watch. They've had a recommendation from a friend or family member, or seen some marketing. But most of the time, right, 60% of the time, you want to watch something new, you're sitting down to watch TV and you still haven't made up your mind, right? So that's when you go into, we talk about browsing mindsets, right? Yeah, and so you sort of, as soon as you see this sort of data, you're going to go, well, of course, because you recognize it in yourself. But I think often it's that classic thing of whatever industry you work in, you're more obsessed about your own product than anyone else is, and so you like to think that people are constantly thinking about, what am I going to watch on TV tonight? And the reality is, people have worked hard, they've got home at the end of a long day, they put on the TV, they know they want to watch something new and exciting, but they don't yet know what that's going to be. And so they go into these browsing sort of mindset or browsing occasion. And in those occasions, two things that will become therefore really important. So one is sort of, as marketers would call, physical prominence, right? You've got to be there. You've got to be on the platform that people are watching. So therefore, our distribution strategy is really important, like making sure ITV's channels and streaming service is everywhere, available to people. But then the other thing marketing we talk about is mental prominence, right? So physically be available and mentally be available, which that's just a clever way of saying brand, right? Is ITV one of the first brands that comes to mind when people are sitting down to watch television? And so that's why we think brand is really important. Ultimately, of course, it's just a pathway to content, but brand is a big sort of lever of decisions.
And how would you, I mean, I guess you touched on it in the beginning as well, how would you like categorize or like put what ITV is as a brand into words almost? Like, how do you identify it and then package that up, and then somebody, when they're browsing, they know what they get when they come to ITV?
I mean, that is what There's No Place Like ITV is hopefully going to do over time, right? And as I say, that's the sort of line. But as I say, the two pillars behind that are this idea of relatability and belonging. That's what we think stands us out in the market, versus everyone else. And what's not nice is actually that's what viewers tell us makes ITV stand out in the market.
And then let's talk about the market for a minute, because I have to ask you, and with streamers, it's incredibly competitive, and elephant in the room is that they did come along and sort of destroy the model, and then everyone's had to rebuild a bit. What does it feel like working on the inside, trying to compete with players like Netflix and Disney and all of those guys that are coming in? And it's been a thing for a while, but like, what does that sort of challenge feel like in your day to day, and how you, yeah, what does that feel like from the inside of
Yeah,
a
yeah. I mean, it's
legacy broadcaster?
yeah. I mean, we'll come back to the legacy word in a minute, maybe. But
Didn't say legacy.
no, but yeah. Look, it's never been a better time to be a viewer. I mean, apart from the almost too much choice, it's never been a better time to be a viewer. There's amazing content out there across lots of different services. You're right, though. If you're one of the brands or platforms competing in that market, it's definitely tough. I mean, I guess what I'd say is the positive spin on this is, as a marketing challenge, certainly, it's much more interesting now than it was back in 2008, right? 2008, sort of everything was easy, right? So it's definitely a more interesting marketing challenge now. Look, I think it comes back to brand again, right? Because all in that sort of competitive market, you just have to be really clear about where's your gap in the market. You know, you need to make sure that you're offering something to viewers that is different to what everyone else is offering, and is also really compelling to those viewers. I think the danger is in trying to ape, somebody else or copy somebody else too much, and trying to therefore be a, we don't want to try and be a poor man's Netflix, because we're never going to out Netflix, right? We can be the best ITV in the market, and no one else can do what we do. So I think we just need to be really confident about who we are, and I think ITV really is, having that confidence now, as I say, and double down on what we are. I think what's also interesting in terms of that competitive market, as you say, because they came along, the streamers, as you call it, and sort of changed the model. There was definitely a period of time where there was a difference between sort of the broadcasters and the streamers in terms of the distribution method. Right? We were linear channels, and they were on-demand services. And those two things have sort of collapsed together now, right? So, all the broadcasters have launched streaming services and leaning into that. And equally, the global streamers have sort of become more and more like broadcasters. They're increasingly dropping shows weekly now because they don't want to drop them all at once. They've added ad breaks to their services. Increasingly, they're starting to do live. So I think it's really interesting how the distribution models have slightly collapsed together. And therefore, in that world, brand and content are the only things you've got to distinguish yourself, I think.
Yeah, and I thought, yeah, because Netflix with ads, with doing live sports, like you said, a bit like the sports rights.
I think we like to swim in terminology in TV land as well, but it's interesting how you sort of, a new terminology comes along, and then you sort of look at it and go, it sounds a bit like, it's like fast channels. So I don't know if you've heard that one. So fast, free, ad-supported streaming television, which is essentially a playlist where you take, on-demand content and you put it into a playlist, often called, or a schedule, you could call it, and you put ad breaks in the middle of it. Looks a lot like a broadcast channel, but it's sort of been reinvented for the streaming world.
I did actually write an article a few years ago, and I think I did swear on it, and it was like, what the fuck are fast channels? And it did really well, because I think at the time everyone was like, what is fast? The acronyms in this world are ridiculous.
Love an acronym.
Do you remember when, what's it, the FANGs? When it was like Facebook,
Amazon, Netflix,
Amazon,
Google,
Snapchat were all doing like original content, and everyone in TV was like, oh my God, the FANGs.
No, I mean, I think Box have come out, I think, with an article just this week about this whole point, and just sort of saying we're swimming in terminology, and at the end of the day, viewers don't understand it and don't care, right? It's just TV, whether you call, because we talk about CTV, and we talk about broadcast, we talk about linear, we talk about on demand, we talk about fast. Viewers just see it as TV, right? And so there is just TV, and then the think box point we talk about, and then there's sort of, from a advertiser point of view, there's two ways of advertising on that TV, which is, you can think about mass. Do you want mass reach, millions of people all at the same time, or do you want targeted? But it's really just TV. Yeah.
That's so funny, and it's so true. I mean, I said EPG earlier. I don't know what. No one knows what this is. What was I going to ask you now? Oh, well, I feel like we should come back to, you did call me out a little bit on using the word legacy, and I do think it's interesting, and again, it sort of taps into brand, I guess, in terms of like how, I mean, ITV, British sort of heritage, brand, and I'd love to kind of know how you sort of think about like modernizing, refreshing, but
Yeah.
also part of, I guess, the brand is also being this sort of like,
Yeah.
legacy,
Yeah.
heritage title.
Yeah, I think the only reason I sort of called you out on the word legacy was just
No,
no,
everyone
it's
hates. I use it all the
well, it's
time.
an interesting word, isn't it? And I think, well, I think it taps into.
Heritage is
I think
nice.
it taps into though the sense that I don't know whether it's just the media industry, the marketing industry. We do tend to look down on things that have been around for a long time, right? But I think so ITV's just had our 70th birthday last year.
I was like, happy birthday.
Happy birthday, ITV. Yeah, we had some birthday celebrations last year. But the reason ITV has been around for 70 years is because we've been incredibly successful, right? We've been incredibly successful with viewers. We've been incredibly successful commercially. I would say, therefore, we're hugely trusted by both viewers and by advertisers, and from an advertiser point of view, we're proven, right? So we talk about proven media rather than legacy media. The power of advertising on ITV is absolutely proven. We have built most of the famous brands in the UK today have been built on the back of TV advertising and on ITV. So I think we need to be careful that we don't sort of throw away the great equity that we've got in our brand. But look, yes, we are 70 years old, so of course we do think a lot about how do we make sure we stay fresh, remain relevant. And again, I think it goes back to making sure that the DNA of your brand doesn't change and is really consistent, but we're talking about revitalizing rather than rebranding. So constantly thinking about how do we revitalize the ITV brand to keep it relevant and fresh. ITVX was sort of the perfect opportunity to do that. So with ITVX, we thought about that as not just launching a new product, we thought about that as a sort of moment to revitalise the whole of the ITV brand. When we launched ITVX, actually, we also did sort of give all the broadcast channels a new look and feel at the same time. For that reason, we didn't want to sort of say we're just launching this product and by the way, the broadcast channels still look a bit dusty. It was a sort of moment in time to make people reappraise ITV. And I think this new brand campaign and this brand platform is another sort of moment for us to sort of revitalise the brand. So that's the answer for me, is that it's keep your DNA consistent, but constantly think about how you revitalise.
I mean, I don't know if there's any way to be that prescriptive, but like in your mind, how often should a brand sort of have these revitalizing moments?
I think it's constantly, constantly in little ways, as I say, and then there are just big moments that come along where you kind of go, well, that's an incredible opportunity to sort of really, to sort of make the point. As I say, when you're launching a new streaming service, that's a great moment to do that. But no, we're sort of not thinking, right, what's the next one in 3 years' time? Because I mean, hopefully, if we do this new brand platform correctly, it will be something that we can just keep running and running. But we'll bring the same idea to life in different ways. As I say, the line, there's no place like ITV, and the idea behind it, we want that to be, an idea we're still running in 10 years' time. It won't be the same ads that we ran in January this year, so we'll be bringing it to life in a different way.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, you've talked about you want to hold on to that for the next 10 years. What does the next 10 years look like for you at ITV?
For ITV as a whole,
and you, if you want.
I don't know if I'm still here in another 10 years. I mean,
What exciting stuff do you feel like is sort of coming, or terrifying stuff in terms of what is changing in the market?
AI is the one that we sort of have to talk about. Yeah, it feels like everyone has to talk about at the moment, and look, we're obviously looking at it like everyone is looking at it in terms of what's the opportunities for us. For me, on AI, the key thing is that we are a business that's interested in viewers, right? So we need to make sure our strategy, our marketing strategy, our business strategy remains viewer-led and focused on viewers. I don't think AI should be sort of dictating or defining our strategy, but AI is definitely going to be a really exciting tool to help us deliver that strategy in more powerful ways. So I think it falls into two buckets though when it comes to AI, and so AI is definitely a sensitive subject at a company like ITV because we're such a creative business, right? So I think a lot of creative businesses are a bit, nervous about the impact of AI and how you're going to use it. So for me, I think the way we're thinking about it in marketing is in two buckets. So in the creativity bucket, our view, my view is that human-led creativity is going to continue to have incredible value, and I think potentially even more of a premium in the future. I think in a world where we're all swimming in AI generated creativity or content, I think stuff that's developed by people, particularly if it's developed by people who are like you, which again comes back to the sort of relatability point of ITV, I think that will have real value. So
yeah, the premium element of it is
Yeah.
interesting. I've been talking to a few people about this, whether, that almost like selling the human craft is then
Yeah.
going to become part of your marketing in a way. Like the fact that it's made by humans becomes part of the campaign in its own way.
I think I think there's definitely that's going to be a big sort of, I think that's going to be the sort of pushback against AI. I think a bit. I think people really will seek out, the stuff that's authentically made by other humans. But look, but there will definitely therefore be a sort of supporting role. So in the development of creative, there'll be a supporting role for AI in terms of audience insight, or storyboarding ideas is incredible in post-production of the ideas. But I think it will be human-led on creativity, but AI supported. I think where AI will play more of a sort of lead role is in, I mentioned earlier about sort of more personalized or targeted marketing. That is definitely where you can see AI being incredibly powerful, right? If we're really interested, which we are, in just how do we put, of the thousands of shows we've got on ITVX, how do we make sure we put the right one in front of you? What is the right show for you? AI, as you can see how an AI model can be really brilliant at doing that, and can learn very quickly about which sorts of shows in front of which sorts of audiences. So we're starting to do that already, but that's the bit that I think could be really exciting.
And probably, I guess, from a spend point of view, very helpful, because you would have a lot less wasted, right? If you can individually target somebody who's definitely going to watch that, rather than
and it's just about relevancy and putting the right show in front of the right viewer, and the scale which comes with that sort of approach. So I mentioned earlier about moving from doing 5 shows a month to 100 shows a month. If we want to start moving to doing 1,000 shows a month that we're promoting, you need 1,000 assets, right? Whether that's a bit of key art or a trailer, and so the production of that amount of content will is helped by sort of AI production techniques.
I guess like careful messaging around it, because obviously there's sensitivity in the production community and with viewers sort of not wanting TV and film to be too go too much into that sphere. How delicate do you, from a sort of like comms perspective, handle conversations around that? Does that make sense?
Well, as I say, I think I don't think I think our approach to AI so far is one that's everyone at ITV feels comfortable with. So I think thankfully we're not pushing things in a direction that is making either our colleagues or our viewers nervous. So I think at the moment that the comms therefore are pretty straightforward.
Away from AI then, are there any other interesting sort of developments happening either in marketing or in broadcast in particular that you're just like kind of excited about? And it could be like, I'm doing a lot around sort of like analog ideas and how there's this sort of move to more analog viewing or experiences, or anything in that sense?
I mean, a bit in that area. I think just there will definitely be some stuff that we can do around this. I think a sort of shift that I'm starting to see, which I'm finding exciting, but this is both from a professional point of view, but also just from a personal point of view. It does feel like there's starting to be there was this concept, that we've all been talking about for the last probably 5 or 10 years, that, younger audiences, they've got short attention spans, they won't engage with anything that's long form. It's all got to be snackable, tiny bits. I think there's starting to be a bit of a pushback against that, which I think is, which is interesting and I think a positive thing. I think we're increasingly seeing all audiences, but including younger audiences, really seeing the value in high quality, long dwell time, immersive experiences, right? So, podcasts is probably a prime example of that. There's the huge surge in podcasts. So, I think it was always probably wrong to say there's going to be a whole new cohort of people who don't engage with anything longer than 5 seconds long. I think that's been now clearly proven to be wrong, and I think we're sort of going to see a sort of shift back towards, as I say, sort of much more premium, long form, immersive content. And I think that's a good thing for ITV and something we'll lean into. But as a parent and as a human being, I think that's something that I find reassuring as well.
No, I'm 100% with you on that. And I guess, like, yeah, I mean, I'm just this week, as we're recording, obviously, there's a lot going on in the world. And there's definitely a bit of a pushback on that sort of element of scrolling through your feed and getting everything in these short bursts, and actually that's not doing us much favours. So a sort of return to long form.
Yeah.
I'm very happy.
The
In
best.
terms of stealing an idea for anyone else, I'd love to hear like what brands you particularly like, and it could be in your industry or again like total cross category where you're like, I'd love to steal some of their ideas.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot that we talk about internally. We've actually got a couple of Slack channels internally at work, where one is all about ITV's work in the wild, where we share, where people have seen our own campaigns out there. But the other one is sort of stuff we love from other people. And I mean, some of the brands we talk about a lot, actually, I think this will make sense given our conversation today, are brands which have had a very consistent positioning and sort of idea for their brand over a long time, but are constantly bringing that to life in really interesting new ways. So I think the two we probably talk about most are Specsavers, and they should have gone to, and they just continue the same idea for such a long period of time, but the marketing is constantly so fresh and always doing interesting things with that. And Marmite would be another good example of that, right? Just such a brilliantly simple and brilliantly consistent idea, but constantly being brought to life. And I think you have to admire the bravery of that from those teams. It's sort of, maybe you could say almost a bit lazy. They're stuck with the same idea. It's so brave, I think, in our world, in the marketing industry, in the media industry, because the pressure is just to come up with a completely new thing. So to stick with the same idea, but to go back to the revitalization point, but constantly bring it to life in a fresh way, I think is amazing.
They're two really good examples, actually. I love that one. What was the one that they did that just looked like a van had crashed into a building that was like, should have gone to Spurs?
Yeah,
It was
loads of
so
those. There was a
simple.
great one in Australia, I think, where was it at Sydney Airport? They put up a massive poster at the arrivals which says, "Welcome to Melbourne."
Oh my God!
And just such great ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and the fighting the urge to come in and do new marketing.
Yeah,
is
whether
quite
you're,
difficult.
if you're the new agency on those brands, or you're the new CMO, the new marketing director, the urge to kind of go, I'm going to stamp my mark on this, and I'm going to change it, is always huge. I say we love the new, don't we, in marketing? So I think sometimes to stick to your brand DNA, and bring it to life in a new way is the right thing to do. Yeah.
Love that. Great note to end on. It was so great to have you here.
All right, thank you for having me.
Hope you enjoyed this episode of Brandmakers. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and carry on listening for more.